Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar entitled Sustainability in Dollars and Cents. Thank you for taking your lunch break to attend this webinar. I assure you it will be worth your time. And while we can't serve you lunch, we promise to give you food for thought. My name is Saniza Othman. I'm a founding sponsor and head of the InterChamber and Partnership Committee at the Malaysian Chamber of Commerce. And today, I will be your host and moderator. I wish to thank the Singapore Chamber of Commerce for being our co-hosts and the International Finance Corporation for the support and partnership to make today's talk possible. Today's talk is quite timely. Last year, Hong Kong's chief executive revealed that Hong Kong should be carbon neutral before 2050. In today's program, we've invited Dato Sri Cheah Cheng to give his introductory remarks. Mr. Vivek Pathak, Global Head and Director of Climate Business and IFC, will give a short presentation, which will begin with a video. And in the final part, I will ask Vivek questions. And if we have time at the end, we'll take questions in the Q&A chat box. In the interest of time, I won't read out our speaker's biography. They have been succinctly put together on our website, and I won't do it justice by condensing them. Without further ado, may I invite my good friend and a founding sponsor of our chamber, Dato Sri Cheah Cheng, the man behind Value Partners and our Warren Buffett of the East, for his introductory remarks.
Thank you. I have tried to find one picture that shows the trouble we are in. This chart, published recently in the Financial Times, is what I found. The chart shows that in the past 2,000 years of human civilization, the human population was mostly flat, with several hundred people occupying the earth. Then suddenly, in the past 150 years, there was a big jump in the global population to 7.8 billion people today. That's the blue line on the chart in front of you. This is the result of the Industrial Revolution in the past 1.5 centuries and the age of science. Today, the average human being lives to 73 years old. That's a big change from the past. For most of recorded history, a human being on average died before the age of 30, before the age of 30. That's the red line on your chart. Now you can understand the crisis. We, the human race, have become a victim of our own success. The same planet Earth, is being used to support a sudden explosion in the living population of human beings, their wants, their needs, their crowding out of other life forms, and destruction of the environment. Global warming has become alarming. If left unchecked, large areas of the world around the equator might become too hot for human habitation in the medium-term future. As people from Malaysia, we should take very careful note of this, especially. We have to do whatever we can to overcome the crisis before we end up passing the point of no return. So I think it's very much to the credit of Ms. Saniza Othman that she has organized and led this conference that deals with the subject of climate. Saniza, an experienced lawyer, together with husband, Michael Yong Haron, a leading private banker, are founding sponsors of MAYCHAM and are distinguished and very active leaders in our community here in Hong Kong. It's also very pleasing that we have here a co-host, the Singapore Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong, whose support is highly appreciated. And we have a high-power speaker today, Mr. Vivek Pathak from the International Finance Corporation, a member of the World Bank Group. Mr. Pathak is IFC's Global Head of Climate Business. Since its founding in 1956, the International Finance Corporation and its parent organization, the World Bank, have been key players in playing a catalytic role and providing development finance to promote the growth of developing countries. I myself, as a former financial journalist and now a fund manager, have personally witnessed how the IFC here in Asia has been very successful in carrying out its mandate. Its focus on the development of private enterprise and, very importantly, the development of markets facilitate growth and transformation in our region. A warm welcome to Mr. Pathak, and let the conversation with Saniza begin. Thank you.
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Cheng, for your kind remarks and for having me here. And thank you very much, Saniza, for having me here as well. Before I start with my presentation, I thought I'd just share a short video which sort of set the stage for all of us. So I thought I'd start with that video because I think in a nutshell, in a few minutes, it all gives us a sense of what's happening around the world. It's also important to understand, and from my perspective, I think I've been in this business in IFC now for 22 years. And when I started out here, the whole area of sustainability and climate, unfortunately, to the corporate world was more of a CSR activity. And it was very frustrating for some of us because the tech sector in California and across the world was able to attract billions, if not tens of billions of dollars. And it was a very high risk sector, but clean energy, renewable energy was unable to attract even hundreds of millions of dollars. And the reason for that was because for everybody, sustainability was a nice little box which you wanted to tick, and it came from your philanthropy or it came as part of your CSR. It was not mainstreamed. The good news is over the past few decades, or the past decade at least, that sustainability and climate has been mainstreamed. The corporate sector and governments have understood clearly the importance of not acting. And at the same time, fund managers are now understanding the importance of not only doing it right, but also I think there is a clear understanding and clear evidence that you do not have to compromise on returns if you do the right thing. So we've got a convergence coming where doing good and making money are no more at cross purposes. I've got a brief presentation which I'd like to take you all through. So I'll just briefly take you through it. I think, this was a few years ago when they said that we have slightly over a decade. I think that just over a decade is gone now. I think just last evening, I was on a session with Secretary Kerry, who's been appointed as the climate change czar by the Biden administration. And the urgency in his voice was, on one hand, it was shocking. On the other hand, it was heartening to see that he and people like him are behind this cause. And I think everyone's understood that if you don't act, it's not only we're going to leave a world worse for our kids and grandkids, it's going to impact our lives in the coming few years. The context is, I think the good news is that there's increasing momentum. Countries, the private sector have started taking action. Excellent news for us was that the US has rejoined the Paris Agreement. And we've got almost over 100 countries, including China, Japan, and the EU, that have signed up for what they call net zero targets. So net zero targets are essentially when you say that you want to continue growing your economy, but your carbon emissions will not increase, or you can buy carbon credits. The private sector is moving very fast. Over 1,500 companies have set net zero targets. Carbon markets are increasing. We're seeing pickup. After the collapse of the Kyoto Protocol, everyone thought that's the end of the carbon market, carbon trading markets. I think it's picking up again. We have some way to go. The financial sector is increasingly focused on this part of both from a risk management perspective, because today fund managers and banks are trying to see, where is my portfolio? Is my portfolio in a segment of the market or a geographic location which may be more prone to climate risk, more flooding, more typhoons, more droughts? Am I in a sector which may have stranded assets? Am I big in thermal energy, which may be stranded asset in a decade or two from now? And also, I'll talk about it later, the importance that the financial sector is going to play to direct more and more capital towards the sustainability space or the climate space. The UN process is on, and I'm sure you'll have heard of the COP. I still recall President Macron when the COP was held in Paris, when he said, there ain't no plan B because there ain't no planet B. If you don't get it right, yes, I know there are people who are talking about, settling on Mars and et cetera, but I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime. So really, when you look at COVID, which is occupying all our time and concerns and lives these days, COVID is something I feel confident we will get across. It is reversible. We'll have a vaccine, we can figure it out. Climate change is not reversible. Once we get to 2 degrees above, it's going to be very, very hard to come back to normal. So it's one of those changes which is not reversible. We at the World Bank Group just took our climate change action plan, which is what we're planning to do for the next 5 years. We had a preliminary discussion with our board, and it got quite some coverage in the press about a week, 10 days ago. And our commitment is that we will do 35% of all our lending will be climate positive. And we will also work with countries, which is very important, to get on the right path, because these are developing countries and we need to work with them to help them decarbonize their economy. This is a slide which is just for effect, you can argue, but it's quite hard hitting because it tells us really we should be at less than 1.5% maximum. And as per current projections, I think we'll be anywhere between 2.8 to 3.2%. Now, when you tell somebody, oh, it's not a huge difference, 1.5 to 2.8%, it is a huge difference. I mean, we will see increased droughts. We'll see increased, reduced levels of rainfall in some parts of the world. Rising sea levels. I think something which many of us don't want to acknowledge or don't even recognize is the fact that as the temperature rises, you're going to have the ice and the snow in the Antarctica and Arctic Ocean melting. When that melts, sea levels rise. Jakarta is going underwater, as we all know. The Maldives, the whole country is in danger. A lot of Pacific islands where I've been to and where we do business are in danger. So it's really absolutely critical that we get this right in the coming decade, not in the coming decade, actually starting today. So just to give you a sense, if we were to restrict the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, global emissions between now and in the next 10 years would have to come down by almost 7.5%. Yeah. And by 2050, if you have to achieve what we want to achieve, emissions will have to decline by almost 60%. Yeah. Now, as a development banker, how do I square this up with countries wanting economic growth? At the end of the day, when you grow your country, when you grow your economy, you're going to increase emissions. And that's where really we have to work together with the government, the CSOs, the private sector, and entities like ourselves on how do we come up with long-term strategies which over a time will help countries decarbonize. The good news is it's happening. Renewable energy, and I still recall when I ran risk for IFC, I had the distinction of having declined or say no to our first 3 investments in renewable energy. I think I was wrong now, I look back at it. But the reason I said no at that time was at 26 cents, there was a lot of subsidy going in, and the average taxpayer in emerging markets could not afford 26 cents for a kilowatt hour of energy. The good news is today in countries like India, we're down to 2 cents. In countries like Zambia, we're down to less than 5 cents. So we've achieved great parity for solar and wind in a number of markets. A lot more needs to be done, but we're getting there. One sector which people don't realize is a huge emitter of GHG emissions is the agricultural sector, the methane emissions. And how do we square that circle? As people get richer, they want to eat higher proteins. As people are getting wealthier, their lifestyles improve. Do we deny people that luxury which they've worked so hard to get? So I think the agricultural sector is one which I think deserves a lot more attention. But we are seeing green shoots. We are seeing companies and firms moving towards. We did a very interesting deal in China a few years ago. By tweaking the animal feed mix, we actually reduced methane emissions by almost 30% there. So there are technologies coming out there on carbon capture, carbon sequestration. So we are getting there, but it's something which I think needs a lot more attention. Green buildings is another one, and I'm delighted to say that this building where I'm sitting today, the Marriott in Hong Kong, I was just talking to the owner, Mr. Gan, and he said, this is a green building, so I'm happy to hear that. But green buildings is a huge growth opportunity. We did a report a few years ago which said the green buildings opportunity in Asia Pacific is itself about $15 to $17 trillion. So if we can make sure that every new building that comes on is green, and we can start retrofitting existing buildings and make them green, it's a win-win for everybody. Green buildings cost more, but the payback periods have come down very significantly. The payback periods, which were more than 5 years about 10 years ago, are now down to 2 to 3 years. So after 2 to 3 years, you're actually going to make money because in a green building, you use less water, so your water bills come down. You use less energy, almost 30% less energy, so your energy bill comes down. So your day-to-day operating costs in a green building are going to be lower than that of a brown building. The other good news is that technology and climate are now coming. There's a confluence there. So a lot of technology firms and venture capital firms are seeing what role can they play. So we've got things like IoT. How do you better manage mini grids? How do you better manage transport? We've done two investments which are both very profitable in India and China, which was essentially to a trucking company, which uses technology to reduce the time that their trucks spend empty on the roads, which effectively means less carbon emission. So if your truck is going from point A to point B without any payload, you're just emitting carbon for no financial gain or no productive use. Yeah. We also recently did a very interesting investment in a US company called Appeal, which is a combination of agri-tech, which is basically they have come up with an organic solution which helps food rot slower, or which helps preserve food more. This is organic, it's not a chemical. So I'll show you all on another slide where food waste is a huge issue. So this is the kind of things, and the good news is that with the confluence of technology and climate, we're going to see some very innovative solutions coming out. The bad news is natural disaster is something we can't control. Losses are about 76 billion in 2020, and a significant increase. And all of us in Asia regularly read about typhoons coming Japan, Philippines, the Pacific, Indonesia. The frequency has increased substantially. And as I said earlier, almost 1/3 of the food produced by farmers is wasted. So this company called Appeal, which I talked about earlier, that will helpfully reduce this wastage. So if we can get this 1/3 down to 5%, we're going to be talking about lower carbon emissions, lower usage of water, less soil degradation, better conservation of biodiversity. Very quickly, I'll take you through, whereas the positive news, as I said earlier, was renewable energy costs are low and it's increasing. In Asia, at least, coal continues to grow. So if you'll just look at the bottom right pie, in middle income countries, year before last, coal was still at almost 50%. Renewables have gone up very significantly over the past decade. Nuclear is still slow in this part of the world. But I think we really need to get the coal down to a much, much lower number and ultimately not only reduce, but hopefully eliminate our reliance on coal. And like I said, solutions are coming, costs for renewables are coming down. So I'm quite confident if countries and companies work together, we can get there. The other good news is that banks have said that they will think twice before lending to coal now. And that is going to be a huge factor. Recently, I heard some banks in a certain country say, yeah, I don't think we're going to finance this coal-fired power plant anymore. But it's important that we continue to ensure that the cost of renewables remains affordable, because we cannot deny the average person, the average taxpayer, the average citizen, access to energy. That is just grossly unfair. So we need to come up, and that's what we're coming up with. At IFC, we've done a lot of work in that space in ensuring that the cost of renewables continues to come down and grid access is there for everybody. Just a little bit about ourselves. I normally don't like to talk. We're not a very large institution. We're the largest for the private sector in emerging markets. About 30% of our commitments were in climate-friendly investments last year and the year before. The reason I'm showing this chart is because when we were the pioneers in investing in renewable energy, which is largely wind and solar about 15 years ago, the bad news for us is that our wind and solar portfolio is really not growing. That's the green bar chart, which has remained consistent at about $2 billion. The good news is that a lot is happening and commercial banks are now coming in, which for us is a very positive sign that we're not needed in this space in many countries. Commercial banks have understood the risks, they're willing to accept the risks, they understand the sector, so they're going. Two sectors that are growing very rapidly for us are the financial sector, which is the purple bar, and the light brown bar, which is green buildings. And like I said earlier, green buildings is really critical because as Asia continues to grow and prosper, urbanization increases. As urbanization increases, you're going to have more and more buildings. Everybody wants a place to stay, a place to work. COVID notwithstanding, people may want to work from home, but I still think people are going to have offices. And, you're going to shop, you're going to travel, you need hotels. So greening the real estate sector is really going to be critical. And for any of you all on this call who are in the real estate space, I would love to engage with you all and see how we can work together. The financial sector is critical because as the pot of money for the green economy increases and the pot of money for what I call the gray economy or the brown economy reduces, I'm hoping that the green economy will start to see lower interest rates and better capital appreciation. There is already evidence in that. HSBC did a report a few months or years ago, which said that companies with good ESG practices have outperformed their peers on the stock exchange. So what is IFC doing very quickly? Like I said, we're focusing on clean energy, and clean energy for us now is things like offshore wind, which has huge potential, very successful in countries like the UK. We're hoping to replicate some of that success in Asia. Climate smart cities, like I said earlier, we need to work with governments to make sure as cities expand, as urbanization increases, that it's done with as decarbonized or minimum carbon impact as possible. And part of the solution is in green buildings. I talked about green finance and the importance, and we're seeing a lot of pickup. I recall about 5 years ago when I started talking to banks, saying, let's do a green bond. Most bank CEOs said no interest. It has picked up. I mean, in the Philippines, we've done a number. In China, we've done a few. Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam. So we are seeing a pickup. I think financial institutions are recognizing the importance. We're also engaging with a lot of funds, private equity funds, who are keen to green their portfolios. So essentially, this is what we're trying to do in IFC. New sectors that are coming up, I just thought I'd touch upon them. Green hydrogen is a big thing. The Japanese companies are looking at it in a big way. So green hydrogen is clean. It's still not there at, we still haven't seen it at a commercial level of a commercial use. Costs are high. But I think this has huge potential. Offshore wind, like I said earlier, huge potential in Asia, countries like Vietnam, we're looking at it. Distributed generation, so this essentially means that you will not need huge power plants, you will not need transmission lines. These are sort of, smaller cities can have their own generation. Greening of supply chains, huge opportunity as large corporates want to start greening their supply chains. That's a huge opportunity again. Marine plastics is a favorite of mine, which is why blue economy, I wear blue, is a huge opportunity. And again, it's about how do you manage waste? How do you increase recycling and reduce usage of single-use plastics? Green buildings I've talked about earlier. For those of you in the investment space, it's potentially a $26 trillion market globally. Electric vehicles, I'm sure all of you in Hong Kong see Tesla, but I think we're seeing a lot of innovation in that space. The costs are coming down. So I think we're going to see a lot more affordable EVs coming in. Green bonds, I talked about it earlier, huge market picking up in a big way. And greening of SMEs. Now, this is an area that we don't focus on always because the large corporates have recognized the risk and they're moving on. But how do you go and green the SMEs, which in many countries are between 50 to 70% of the market? So that's where we are trying to work with commercial banks to get there. These are just some examples of what IFC has done. We did a very interesting deal in Pakistan last year, which is, we did 6 wind farms together, almost over $300 million. We did the first issuance for a green bond in South Africa, all of sub-Saharan Africa, actually, for Standard Bank. Green buildings, and the reason I talk about this here is that normally if you go and talk to a healthcare company or education company and you ask them to go green, their response is, how can we go green? But simply by making sure that the buildings they're operating in are green, I think we can go a long way. And I talked about climate smart cities. So we did a very interesting deal with the city of Belgrade, which took us, I think, 3 or 4 years to develop, for waste to energy. And waste to energy is a big area because as urbanization increases, you're going to have a lot more waste. And landfills are running out. So, space is becoming scarce, expensive. So we need a better way to manage our waste. And one way is to try and segregate it and convert at least part of it into energy. Climate smart agri I talked about. We did something very interesting in the wood pulp space in Brazil, where we essentially used wood-based materials to get it done. So these are a few of the things that we're doing. I just touch very quickly upon Edge, which is a tool that we've developed for green building. It's a very simple, easy to use tool, and we're seeing a lot of pickup in it. And any of you all, like I said earlier in real estate, we don't invest directly in Hong Kong because it's a developed market, but it's a public good tool. So we're very happy to engage with you all and work with you all on this. So with that, I just want to conclude by saying, most of us say that it's for large corporates, government, somebody else to do it. But I think each one of us has a responsibility of our own. Each one of us, simple things like, switching the light off when you go out, not wearing a tie. I don't wear a tie because my view is that if you can increase the temperature in the room by 2 or 3 degrees, and you don't wear a jacket or a tie, you can actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions by consuming less energy. Refusing to use single-use plastics. Carrying your own shopping bag when you go to the supermarket. I know each one of these things in itself, we'll say don't count too much, but if all of us was to do our little bit, I think we can make an impact as well. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Vivek, for those for that very interesting presentation. It's a wake-up call for humanity. So let's start with our questions. My first question is about marine plastic, a topic I know you're passionate about. In the last decade, more plastic was made than in the century before. Half of those plastics are disposable. And while plastic may be disposable, these plastic products are durable and indestructible. And almost every plastic made on this planet is still on our planet, around in some form or the other. And they've found our way into our oceans and of course into our food source. It is said that over 80% of ocean plastic leaks come from land-based sources. So of course, in the long term, we do need to clean up our ocean. But what about the short term? Will the world move into artificial fisheries? And what more can we do in this area?
So, you know, the interesting thing is, and I'll just deviate for a minute on how I got engaged in plastics, Saniza. About 2.5 or 3 years ago, I got my blood test done, and I'm very unhealthy in most things, but I had my mercury levels in my body were 2 to 3 times what they should be. So I was told technically I should have died of poisoning by now, but it didn't happen. I started researching it just to, you know, why is it? And people said I eat a lot of fish, it's got to be healthy. Fish has mercury, and that's when it hit upon me, and I saw some very hard-hitting videos on the fact that we're not only eating plastics, as you said, Saniza, through our food chains, through fish and even vegetables. We're drinking plastics because it's there in our water sources. And surprise, surprise, we're breathing plastics. Microplastic organisms are there in the air because every time you keep some plastic out, some of it starts to get absorbed in the air as well. So that's where I got engaged. Now, see, I would say in the long term, no, we need to clean up our oceans in the short term, to be honest. I think we're going to see solutions. So we recently did a deal in Thailand with Indorama Ventures, which is one of the largest producers of PET. And their objective is in the next, I think, 5 or 6 years that they want to make sure that at least 30% of their plastics will be recycled. So recycling of plastics is going to be critical. And for that, we need the entire supply chain to be there. Right from in our own houses, when you drink from a bottle of Coke, where do you throw it? You put it in your regular trash, or you keep it separately. Stop using plastic straws. My 11-year-old daughter, who Saniza knows, actually banned plastic straws in her house. She's figured this out, so no plastic straws. So each one of us can do our bit. Like I said earlier, no single-use plastic bags. So I think that's what's going to happen clearly. I wouldn't say, I mean, artificial fisheries, I think, you know, you are going to, there are things like this which are being piloted, and I think this will increase. So some of this will happen, but that will not take away from the fact that a piece of plastic that you trash, I'm told, could take between 500 to 600 years to degrade. So we're also seeing some very interesting examples. We're working with a company in Vietnam as we speak, which makes biodegradable plastic under certain conditions. Early stages, but again, some very interesting things happening in the plastic space. But plastics is one thing, let me reiterate, is each one of us has to do our bit. I have been seen walking out of Great Food Hall with 7 Coke cans like this because I just said I'm not going to take a plastic bag from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek. That was very inspiring. My next question was something you touched upon. So it's electric vehicles. So earlier this week, Hong Kong's environmental minister identified the transition to electric vehicles as part of his decarbonization plan. You mentioned the EV market will grow to a potential of 2.7 trillion by 2030. When Tesla came out, I converted our patrol cars into electric vehicles. I feel like I'm making a difference to bring down the carbon emissions, especially in rush hour traffic. I would rather be standing behind an electric vehicle than a petrol car. But my question is this: what happens to the battery at the end of its life? Is the electric vehicle really a sustainable solution for the automotive market, or are we really kicking the can down the road? Thank you.
So there's a lot of time and a lot of money being put into this space right now because I think it's the next big thing which people say will happen. There a huge business opportunity is recycling batteries there. So we actually did a deal and we're looking at another transaction as we speak, both of them in China, about which recycle batteries there. Are we kicking the can down the road? See, there again, it's when we talk about electric vehicles, one important factor you have to take into account is what is your source of energy. Because if your source of energy which you recharge your battery with is going to be coal, I don't know whether you're really reducing greenhouse gas emissions and by how much, and that math is being worked out then. So that's one part of the equation. So look at the entire value chain. And I completely agree with you, Saniza, that if you're really just going to produce batteries and then throw them in a landfill and they're going to pollute your groundwater, that's not going to solve any problems. You may solve something in the short run, but for the medium term, it's like you said, kicking the can down the road. So a lot of money is actually going into how you recycle these batteries efficiently. Different sort of battery solutions are going to come up in my view. We look at sodium ion, nickel ion, nickel cadmium. You're going to have different solutions coming out. But for those of you who are looking at the next big business opportunity, I think recycling batteries is going to be the next big business opportunity.
So that's great. To all our Zoomies out there, there's a great business opportunity. You can be great. You can be friendly to the environment and make good business sense there. Let's see here. In your presentation, you mentioned green buildings and retrofit, and you mentioned that they had a potential of 26 trillion by 2030. So here in Hong Kong, I understand it's easier to grow, to apply green standards to new buildings, but what about old buildings? As you look around in Hong Kong, there are a lot of older industrial and commercial buildings. How does one go about retrofitting them to a green standard? And how feasible is it to upgrade these buildings? And how much of a role should the government take in leading this initiative?
So I talked about a tool called Edge, which is a green building tool, but we've recently come up with another tool, which is Edge Retrofit. So Edge, basically, it really helps you retrofit a building and make it greener. Now, it depends on how old the building, so I don't think the retrofitted building will be as green as a new build, which is going to be very hard to do, and the costs are going to be prohibitive. But it certainly makes it greener, and we've got some standards we're working on. We're piloting it as we speak. I am really hopeful that this works out, and I would really want to roll this out. We're already talking to 4 banks across the world to roll this out for all their clients. The payback period, so the financial side of the story is quite clear. Your payback period for the retrofit is probably 3 years today. So in 3 years, you've recovered your capital that you spent, and after that, it's all gravy because your energy costs and your water costs come down. So I think this is here to happen. Now, there will be a lot of innovation in this space, but I think this is really the big thing because if you look at Asia, real estate is built and stays for, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So, and it's not like you're going to tear down a building and you can build a green building in 5, 7, 10 years. So I think retrofitting is going to be the way out, and I'm hoping we'll continue to see a lot of investments going into the space.
Wonderful, thank you. That sounds very positive. And considering we're in Hong Kong with a lot of old buildings, this is definitely a step in the right direction. So I can see lots of questions coming in into our chat box. And let me ask a couple more before we move to the audience questions. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about greenwashing, green financing, if you like. So in recent times, there have been Financial Times headlines that reads, World Top Fund Manager has one of the worst rankings for voting on green proposals. Of course, I won't mention the name of the asset manager, but the gist of the article was criticizing an $89 trillion asset management industry, and in particular, how asset managers are tackling climate change. While large fund managers recognize that global warming will hurt their investment performance, many are talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk. Do you agree with these criticisms? And more importantly, what can be done about it?
So, like with everything else, it's not black and white, Deb. And I think the good news is, when Larry Fink announces he's going to look at his $9 trillion that that BlackRock manages through a sustainability lens, that's really music to my ears. Because we need large pools of capital to come into this space. If they're not going to come in, we're not going to be able to move the needle in a significant manner. Is it going to be an overnight process? Absolutely not. I mean, this is a transition. You cannot one day wake up and say, I'm going to throw everything that's not green out of my portfolio. I'm not going to, you can say I will not do anything brown going forward, but I have a portfolio. We have a portfolio in our institution where we've got legacy assets which are not very green. So I think that's a fact of life. So we really need, and there's a lot of talk now about transition economy and just transition. So how do we transition out of a carbon intensive economy into a decarbonized economy? I think that is the key thing. But when you talk about greenwashing, I'll just touch upon a thing which is very close to my heart, is the importance of setting up standards. We need standards if you want to be able to attract the large pool of capital, the $89 trillion that's out there. These investors will want confidence that when they're putting something in what is classified as green, is it actually green or not? So today, even for green bonds, you have the EU standards, you have the ASEAN standards, you have the Chinese standards, you've got ICMA standards or principles. But I think we need, so I would love for us to be in a position where, like today, if I invest in a bond, and I know it's a double B minus or a triple A plus, I know what it is. I would love for us to have green standards, which will say this is triple green, double green, or whatever, and there can be multiple standards. So investors can say, I'm happy to invest in something that's not right at the top, but in the middle, but it's still greener than the rest. I think we need standards to make sure greenwashing doesn't happen.
Thank you, Vivek. I really like when you said that we need to start transitioning. I just hope that it goes faster. So I finished my last assignment for the FT non-executive diploma. And part of my coursework was to evaluate a company's annual report and their website to see how it approached its environmental, social, and corporate governance. And when I was looking at various large companies in Hong Kong, what surprised me a little bit was I saw it as a box ticking exercise and not really integrating ESG into their corporate culture. So coming back to the title of the webinar, ESG needs to make business sense. How would you advise companies to integrate ESG into its corporate culture?
Well, you want an honest answer, how it should be done? It should be in the DNA of every staff member, to be honest. Yeah. And I mean it because, at the end of the day, it's like profitability hopefully is in the DNA of every staff member, everybody who works in the firm. Their ultimate objective is how do we make more profit? I think similarly, we need to be in a position where everyone says, how do we make good profit and be sustainable? I'm not saying sacrifice profitability in the long term for sustainability. In the short term, there may be a trade-off sometimes, but short term. And I'm a big believer that if you're talking about a trade-off over the next 10 years, I don't think it'll fly. So I think companies need to make a start. One is, clearly have a clear vision, have policies, have a game plan, have a map on how you're going to get there, map out the tasks, and start educating their employees at the same time. I think that's absolutely important because at the end of the day, if the average person working in your firm doesn't believe in this, I think it's going to be very hard to get there. Everybody has to believe there has to be a common goal. It's like a soccer team. Everyone's pulling together, all 11 players try to get to the goal at the other end. And that's the same thing for sustainability. The entire team has to pull together.
Absolutely. I agree with that. It's very inspiring what you say. I think change must begin from an individual. And from there, we can make a more powerful impact on society. And I hope that our Zoomies go away with this message if there's anything they heard. So that's wonderful. So just changing gear a little bit, I wanted to ask about the financial markets because you are a banker. With quantitative easing and the debasing of currencies, some of our investors are moving into alternative currencies. For example, Bitcoin. I understand that from recent statistics that Bitcoin mining consumes almost the same amount of electricity output, for example, as Malaysia as a country. I understand that 70% of Bitcoin mining takes place in China, and it takes place using electricity mainly generated by coal. Do you have any thoughts on this?
So I have to say, I'm old school in this. I don't follow Bitcoin, to be honest. I'm an old school. I'm not an economist by training, but I believe a currency should have an intrinsic value. But on the second point, yes, we have been hearing how Bitcoin mining consumes a lot of energy. And there are certain provinces where I've told energy costs are low. Actually, interesting enough, I don't know if it's coal or wind, but possibly wind is what they're doing in places like Inner Mongolia. This is what I've read, so please don't hold me to it. But I think ultimately, the way the world is moving, if, the person who founded Tesla, if he believes in Bitcoin, I'm sincerely hoping he'd also realize that Bitcoin should not be a large emitter of carbon.
And to that's a great point to be made. So as we've been chatting, I have been monitoring our Q&A and have to say that you've engaged our audience, to say the least. And I think it's fair that I take away my moderator's hat and try and go through some of these questions with you. So can we start with an observation for Michael? He's said that, continuing on Vivek's theme, that sustainability needs to make business sense. Can Vivek share some performance returns on investment and sustainability? There is a perception that green means lower returns. Can you demystify this perception? Thank you.
I see a report which came out sometime back, which actually said that companies with good ESG practices have outperformed the index, so their peers in a similar industry. Now, I think this misperception may be coming from 15, 20 years ago, when the price differential, say, between coal or thermal power and solar and wind was 10 cents, when either the company that was in that space did not make money or required a large amount of subsidies to be viable. But I think that situation has changed quite dramatically in the past few years. Like I said, green buildings, you have a green building, you have a brown building. The green building may cost you more and your payback period is 2 to 3 years. But in the long term, if you're a believer in long-term sustainability, if you're in it to make a quick buck in the next 36, 48 hours, that's different. But in the long run, a green building will have more intrinsic value than a brown building. I mean, this is just simple math, I can tell you. And you can ask anybody in real estate and they'll tell you it's true. Now, some sectors may be a bit behind, but I think we have to move towards a place where, to me, like I said in the beginning, if it doesn't make good business sense, let the philanthropy folks do it. Then it's not for commercial investors.
That's a fantastic message, I think. And I hope that, that's a big takeaway, I think, from today, that for sustainability to be sustainable, it must make good business sense. Let's see here. Listening to you, I wanted to ask, which Asian country actually do you see as a role model in leading its way in terms of smart cities? Which Asian country can we learn from?
I'm not going to answer that one directly. Oh. But no, it's very hard to say one Asian city is performing. So smart city is a concept. See, a smart city can be a subset in a city. A smart city can be a development that you're building outside KL or Jakarta. So I don't think I'd be in a position to say any city that's performing better than others. But what I can say is a lot of governments have recognized the urbanization challenge. And therefore, they are moving to set up multi-purpose, not cities, I would call them townships, really, to take the pressure off cities. To convert an existing city to a smart city is a huge challenge. You have to figure out the traffic. And there's a lot of interesting things going on. 20 years ago, you didn't have mass transit systems in most Asian cities. Today, every Asian metropolis that I know of, at least, has a mass transit system. Is that smart? I think absolutely. Now, does smart cities mean that you're going to be a new build? So what we are seeing outside a lot of cities, we've seen it outside Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh, Jakarta, KL, Beijing. You are having townships come up based on a smart city concept there. And it's not that they're 100% smart. I don't know what 100% smart means. But my view is, at least if they're 30, 40, 50% there, that's good news. That's a good start there.
Thank you. That's great. So initially, In one of your earlier questions, you mentioned that everyone must make an impact and they should look within and try to be that change. So I know you have a young daughter, she's very smart. I wanted to ask you, do you feel that our schools are approaching the green agenda in the right way? Are we using our education system enough as an impetus for this green revolution?
So, this has been a big passion of mine because I got my little daughter interested in climate, and I was quite happy. One day she said, I want to be the Greta Thunberg of plastics. And then she reprimands me. So, Baba, I heard you in the shower today. You didn't switch it off when you were, or, she sees me shaving and the water is running. And I think we need to do more to educate the kids of today, not just the impact climate is having on them, but what they should be doing. And I think they are the best people, because if it's ingrained in them, they will hopefully tell their parents, other people around them what to do. And hopefully they will not make the same mistakes all of us have made. So I think getting the not just environment, but I would say a lifestyle on how do you manage yourselves. What is the implication every time you drink from a plastic straw and you trash it? I don't think any of us think of that today. But just getting some of those practical things, and I'm engaging with somebody on the West Coast right now to try and build a curriculum on that. More as a hobby, because I don't know if it will be commercially viable. But a lot of schools are already doing it. My humble opinion is we need to do a lot more, but get it down to a practical level, not a big scientific lesson on the impact of global warming, but what can each one of the kids do and influence their parents and people around them to change their lifestyle, basically.
That's very inspiring again. And I think it's a good message to drive home, particularly I think with a lot of people who've dialed in, have children, have family. So I'm moving back to the Q&A box for some more questions. So I have someone asking, what is the prospect of the carbon trading market in China? Actually, I have a few, and maybe I'll let you choose. And another one is let's see, so a lot about IFC. Is there any difference in terms of funding objectives and the ways of funding between the IFC and green climate funds?
Sorry, I'm actually looking at the chat box, not the Q&A. Okay, let me look at the Q&A.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah, so is there any difference in terms of funding objectives and the ways of funding between? So we at IFC, we've got a pool of capital, which is not returnable. We reinvest our capital. And then we've got a AAA rating, fortunately, and we go out and borrow in the international debt capital markets. And a lot of what we issue is actually green bonds because it's being deployed in the green economy or the climate economy. Green climate funds, I mean, they all have different sources of funding, I suspect. Some of them, like GCF out of Korea, has got a pool of capital from government entities, commercial funds, investors in them. So I think there are different sources of funding. What is the prospect of carbon trading market in China? I think it's high, but I would prefer to see a global carbon trading market, because carbon is it's a commodity, just like we have, any commodity trading is a global market. I would love to see it more at a global scale and sort of put unique regulations. And a lot of work is happening in Singapore, in China, in the US, and Luxembourg. There's a lot of things happening on the carbon trading market. But I think the prospects are very, very positive. But I just want to say something, we should not say, let's continue to pollute the world or have high GHG emissions, and then we will atone for our sin by going and buying a few carbon credits. That's not going to solve the problem in the world, to be honest. Because the amount of carbon credits you need by just one company that will not be named, you will need to have reforest the whole area of Portugal and Spain put together. This sort of carbon credits you need for one company, which is in the fossil fuel space today.
Right.
So carbon credits are important, but not the means to the end, really. There was a question in the chat.
Yes, so the time's coming up, and we have one last question to perhaps take. Would you like to take one of the ones in the chat box?
Yes, so I'll very quickly go through them. I am not an expert on ozone toxicity.
Okay.
So I will not be able to answer that, but I hear what you're saying. I'm afraid not to just answer that. We, as IFC, we finance the private sector, so we are engaged with governments on a lot of issues. But really, this is more the job of the World Bank. This is the question on migrants who may be impacted. This is more what the World Bank does, and I know that the World Bank is doing a lot in the Middle East. I'm not sure about what we're doing in Asia. Then there's a comment on electric car batteries that can be used in startup. Absolutely, I agree. I mean, we're actually looking at some very interesting business models today where you can use a battery in the day, charge it, and then, once it's fully charged, you use it at night again for certain industries which are needed at night. So a lot of very interesting models on the whole EV space are coming up right now.
I think to that end, I think we're coming to the end. I'm mindful that we're keeping people between, we are keeping them between lunch. So we'll start the wrap up and start with our conclusions. So I'm sure everyone on this call, all our Zoomies, agree that this has been a very fascinating 1 hour webinar, and we probably go on looking and judging at all the comments and the questions in the Q&A and chat box. But I think the biggest takeaway is that this is a wake-up call for humanity. We need to change the way we consume food, materials, the way that we use energy, the way that we build homes and offices, and the way we structure our investment portfolios. And absolutely agree that we have to start with the individual, as you point out. The individual action perhaps is the biggest action that we can take away, and I hope the people on the call take heed in that. And I also learned that you shouldn't buy a Tesla with Bitcoin, as it is an inherent contradiction. And with that, as we draw today's webinar to a close, I want to thank all our Zoomies for dialing in and for all their wonderful questions. And then I want to thank Mr. Vivek Pathak and Dato Cheah for their time today. Thank you for dialing in, and we hope to see you at future MAYCHAM webinars. If you are interested in Vivek's presentation materials, I think Vivek has kindly agreed that this can be sent out, but please send an email to our secretariat email, which you can find on our website. So thank you everyone for dialing in. Till we meet again. Bye-bye.